Hi, I'm Kerry Muhlestein, and this is a class on the first half of the Old Testament. Let me tell you just a little bit about me since we're going to spend some time together. I'm from Utah. I have some degrees in ancient Near Eastern studies, Egyptology, Hebrew Bible, Hebrew language and literature. I've been teaching the Old Testament for about 27, 28 years now, and it's one of my favorite things to teach. I just love teaching it, and I think there's so many things we understand better about the gospel when we really have our foundation in the Old Testament. Every other book of Scripture presupposes that you know and understand what's happening in the Old Testament. So you'll understand all of other Scripture and all the gospel better too as we study the Old Testament together. There are some really foundational and fundamental things we'll cover here in the first couple of lessons that will just open so many other things up. And we're also going to try and teach you some key tools for understanding the Scriptures as we go along. So let's just jump right in. We're going to start at Genesis chapter 1. We're going to start, in fact, in the beginning. And today's lesson will cover both the creation and the fall, two of the most fundamental concepts in our religious beliefs. So let's start out by asking, why should we study the creation? We could just jump into the storyline. We could jump to Noah or Adam or Abraham. Why study the creation? And as we ask that question, I think you should think about that for a minute. Let me ask you this question. How many creation accounts do we have? How many can you think of? Let's say, as we go through this, that we've got one in Genesis, a very similar one in the book of Moses, but with some differences. Still fairly similar, but a few more differences in the book of Abraham. And then, of course, there's one in the temple. So we have 4 creation accounts. That's pretty impressive. 4 different accounts. Let's ask this question. How often is the creation repeated for us? How often in a given year do you encounter the creation account? Well, that depends on the person, but let's just say you're reading the Scriptures fairly regularly. You'll probably read it because it's in so many places. You'll probably read it at least once a year. And let's say maybe you're going to the temple once a month. It's likely you're going to encounter the creation account 13 times in a year. Can you think of anything else that you encounter that many times? Even the story of the crucifixion and resurrection, we usually don't read 13 times in a year. It would seem to me that the Lord thinks this is important, that He wants us to get something out of this. And so let's ask ourselves, why does He put this in front of us so much, and what should we get out of it? I would just pause for a second and ask yourself that question and consider writing down some of your ideas. What are some of the reasons that God has us encountering this so often, and what should we get out of it? Okay, hopefully you came up with some good answers. We're not going to come up with all of the answers here. I'm not even going to try and figure out all of the answers or pretend that I know all of them. We're going to highlight just a few right now. And we're going to take this from something that Elder Bruce R. McConkie wrote. You can find this in his article that's called Christ in the Creation. He teaches us, the revealed accounts of the creation are designed to accomplish 2 great purposes. Their general purpose is to enable us to understand the nature of our mortal probation, a probation in which all men are being tried and tested to see if they will do all things whatsoever the Lord their God shall command them. Their specific purpose is to enable us to understand the atoning sacrifice of the Lord Jesus Christ, which infinite and eternal atonement is the very foundation upon which revealed religion rests. So that's worth stopping and thinking about. What can we draw from studying the creation? How can that better help us understand our mortal probation? And how can it better help us understand the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ? Again, I would encourage you to pause and give that some thought. Consider writing it down, but just give that some real thought. What are some things you can learn about your mortal probation and the atoning sacrifice of Christ from studying the creation? Okay. Let me just give you some ideas. Again, I don't pretend to be exhaustive. I'm sure you've come up with ideas I haven't, and I may have come up with some that you didn't, but here are a few ideas. If we're going to first talk about understanding our mortal probation, there are a couple of things that are worth thinking about. Elder John A. Widtsoe taught that it can help us understand our place in the universe. When we look at the vast creation, think about it. When you consider the vast creation, stars, or even just this earth and the beauty and grandeur of this earth, it can make us feel pretty small, and there's something healthy about that. There's something good about the humility that comes with that. At the same time, when we study all of this and see how amazing it is, and then remember that God created it for us to be able to progress and grow and return to be with Him, that should also make us feel pretty important. And that's a pattern we'll find in the Scriptures, that God is both going to humble us and ennoble us at the same time, just leading us carefully up to Him and relying on Him rather than on ourselves. And that will happen naturally as we study the creation. Another thing Elder Whitsoe taught us it can do is that it can help us reform our priorities. Again, when you look at the big picture of things, a lot of things will stop seeming so important. I always joke with my students that when I was a student, on the first day before finals, I would always go to the temple because that made my finals seem less important and I didn't have to study so hard. So that maybe isn't a good idea and isn't good advice, but I think there really is something about looking at that big picture from the very beginning that helps us think about, what am I doing that's just consuming my time that's not important, and what should I be spending more time on? That's an important thing. There are a lot of other ways that studying the creation can help us understand our mortal probation better, but maybe most important is to understand that God and Christ did this for us, and it can help us see the importance of this mortal probation. Let's also talk about understanding the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ and how studying the creation can help us understand this. First of all, it can help us understand who Christ is. Christ, under the direction of the Father and with the Father's power, created this world for us. And not just this world, but worlds without end He created for us. It's estimated, or it's known that there are 70, and I don't even know how to say this number, much less comprehend it, but that many known stars. That's incredible. That's truly beyond my ability to comprehend. But the being who created all of that suffered for me and suffered for you. It helps me understand the might and the majesty of the being who is willing to condescend and come to this earth and suffer so horribly to redeem us. That indeed helps me understand and appreciate the atoning sacrifice of Christ better. When I'm out in nature and I see the beauty and think of all that went into creating it and who that is that created it, I am so grateful to have a personal covenant connection with that being. It helps me understand and appreciate the atoning sacrifice of Christ better. It also, as we study the creation, the way that we understand it as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, it helps us understand that there was a plan from the beginning. From the very beginning, God knew what needed to happen for us and how it needed to happen, and He sent a Redeemer. And that ties in with understanding and setting up the fall. You really can't talk about creation without talking about the fall. You can't talk about the fall without talking about creation. And that also helps us understand that the fall and redemption from the fall were part of that plan from the beginning. These are what Elder McConkie called the three pillars of eternity: the creation, the fall, and the atoning sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And so studying the creation can help us understand the atoning sacrifice of Christ by helping us better understand the fall and what's going on with that. Associated with that is the idea that the earth has to be redeemed. The earth was once in a different state, and we were in a different state. And as the earth changes, so did we change. And if we want to be with God, both the earth and we will have to be changed back. Those are things that are worth understanding. Let's think about another thing that I think should happen as we study the creation account, and that is to think more closely about our relationship with God, our Father in heaven who created us. That's something that's certainly worth understanding. A lot of times as people study the creation, they get caught up in the origin of man. That's a phrase that we often use. How was man created? Was it through evolution or was it through some other means? And we're not here to answer that question. You can find all sorts of things in church articles and sources and elsewhere if you want to investigate that. But here's what we want to focus on. We want to focus on what the Scriptures teach us about the origin of man. mankind has a different place in the creation accounts. And when we talk about the origin of man, it's clear that men and women have some things that are special about them that are different than everything else according to the scriptural text. So one of those things, and maybe the most important, is that men and women have a special or different relationship with God. It's different than every other element of creation. God, certainly there's a relationship because He is the Creator, has a relationship with animals, with plants, with the earth itself. But men and women have a different relationship with God than anyone else. Associated with that, men and women have a different potential. What we can become is like God. And that's not true of any other element of this creation. And so we have to remember our special potential. And because of those, when it comes to the creation account, men and women have a special creation. We are not part of the creation of plants or animals and so on. That relationship and that potential seems to be pointed out by the fact that in the creation accounts, men and women are created separately from everything else and seem to be the crowning point of creation. That teaches us something about who we are in our relationship with God. Finally, we know that we have a different stewardship or role. We have a stewardship over the earth, over all other living things. There's a role that we play that because of our potential and our relationship with God, we have a different place and a different responsibility in this. That's worth thinking about. I would say, though, that in the end, when we think about the origin of man or the origin of mankind and what we need to know about that, everything we need to know is in the first few words of the Genesis account, right here where it says, "In the beginning, God." Whatever else is part of that creation, let's never lose sight of this, that God is where it began and God is where it will end. He is what is behind all of this. He is the one who makes it so that everything else is happening and is possible. In fact, hopefully this helps us focus again on our relationship with God, and we've been taught that so powerfully by a number of prophets. Let me read just two places where some prophets have talked about this. One is from Gordon B. Hinckley. He talked about this in October 2002 General Conference, where he said, "I challenge every one of you who can hear me to rise to the divinity within you. Do we really realize what it means to be a child of God, to have within us something of the divine nature? We can either subdue the divine nature and hide it so that it finds no expression in our lives, or we can bring it to the front and let it shine through all that we do." That's what I hope studying the creation does for us. We remember our divine Father, our relationship with Him, the divinity within us, and we let that shine and affect everything we do and everything we are. I hope that we do that. Let's also read something from Thomas S. Monson, who in an article that was in the Friend or the Liahona or Ensign in June of 2010 said this, "We are sons and daughters of a living God, in whose image we have been created." Think of that, created in the image of God. We cannot sincerely hold this conviction without experiencing a profound new sense of strength and power. That's what I hope will come from exploring the creation, that profound sense of strength and power, and a sense of identity and purpose. Those are things that President Nelson would tell us we should search for, our divine identity and purpose. I should also just say that I'm grateful for my friend Terry Ball, who helped me think through these ideas of the special nature of our creation, and I want to give him credit for that. Let's think of another element of the origin of man, and here we'll say of man and of women, that sometimes people have questions about. And that's the phrase that's translated in the King James Version as helpmeet, where Eve is created to be a helpmeet for Adam. And sometimes that's been used in interesting ways that Sometimes it's been used to oppress women and sometimes just in weird ways. Let's explore what the word really means. The word, it's two words in Hebrew like it is in English. The word is ezer and kinegdo, or kinegdo, but I've divided it out here. That second word is actually a prefix, a root word, and a suffix. So ki and the word neged and o. And let's explore what those mean. The word ezer means to help. It doesn't mean someone who is lower helping someone who is higher. It doesn't mean someone who is higher helping someone who is lower. It's just really means to help. And often it's on an equal basis. Sometimes it's on any of those other bases. It's neutral in that way. In fact, a friend of mine, Rebecca Call, pointed out, as she's done some studies on this, that in many senses, it's help offered, it's aid offered in battle. That's when the word is used most often. And I like that phrase and that idea. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But it's help offered when you really need it, we could say. Let's go through the prefix ki, which is means like or as or according to. All right, so this is it's a prefix that helps us know how to take, it's an adverb really that helps us know how to take the next word. The next word means ahead or in front of. Really in front of is probably the best translation, but ahead or in front of. And then the suffix o means of him. So literally translated, this means help according to what is in front of him. And I think that's a good way to take it. Eve is someone who makes Adam equal to the task that lies ahead of him, just as Adam is someone who makes Eve equal to the task that lies ahead of her. We are helpmeets for each other. In our time of need, in the battle that is this fallen mortal probation, we have someone to help us be equal or up to what lies ahead of us. And I think that's a good understanding of the phrase helpmeet, and it should be understood as an equal partnership and one helping the other. We could draw this out in another way. There's an old Jewish teaching that President Kimball actually picked up on as well and talked about, and that is, why is Eve taken from Adam's rib, which is probably a symbolic thing. And the symbolism is, as it's taught in by these Jewish sages, is if she'd been taken from his head, that would signify that she is ahead of him. If it was taken from his foot, that would signify he's ahead of her or over her. From the rib means side by side, equal, designed to go throughout life, and I would say helping each other be equal to what is ahead of them. I think that's how we should think of this. All right, so with that in mind, let's think about the stages of creation according to the text. There are several different ways to look at this or think of this. There are various stages in creation, and not every creation account has things in the same order or the same stages. To me, that's probably God telling us, don't get too worried about the order. There are things you can learn from it, but learn those things for yourself and then learn something else in another account. But there are stages that are worth thinking about, and we're going to look at the creation account or the text that is in Genesis and see what we can get from that creation account and the way that it's written. Now, in order to understand this, we need to understand one element of this creation account and these phases or stages. We need to take ourselves out of our cultural context and put ourselves in the culture of the ancient Near East. That's going to be one of the great keys to understanding the Old Testament, is we can't keep trying to understand it from our own cultural point of view and force that onto the text and the people. We need to allow them to live in their own cultural context, and we need to be able to try and understand that and understand it from their point of view. So we're going to look at creation the way that it was understood by all of ancient Israel's neighbors, and I believe, or at least one of the ways it was portrayed, and there are things behind that portrayal, concepts they're trying to get to us. I believe it was portrayed and understood in many ways in that same way by the ancient Israelites, and you'll see why I say that as we go along. This has to do with the symbolism of water. For anyone in the ancient world, creation wasn't what we'd call ex nihilo, or out of nothing. It was out of things that already existed. The universe was full of pre-existent matter, things that were already there, they just weren't organized. And for all of these ancient cultures, including Israel, but anyone around them, the Canaanites, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, everyone, this was symbolized by water. In fact, they would call it watery chaos. It's unorganized. It's chaotic is another way of saying unorganized. And when you think about it, water is a great symbol for that. It can take any shape. It doesn't have a form or a shape of its own. We're not talking about on the molecular level. We're talking about the way you and I experience water. You put it in a round bucket, it's going to be round. Put it in a square bucket, it's going to be square. It's just chaotic, right? It doesn't have a form or shape of its own. This is the way that people in the ancient world would think of it as a watery chaos. And when they drew it as water, and they would often draw it just like this. In fact, you take just a couple of those little waves, and that is the way that you depict water in Egyptian hieroglyphs. So you draw water like this, and we're going to draw some, and this is how they would draw, and I'm leaving some gaps here because that's what's going to work for us as we do our what we're trying to do here and draw this for you. But they would draw just water everywhere, and then they would, this would represent the universe before creation began, all right? In fact, the Egyptian phrase for this, the period before creation, is before there were two things. When everything was one just watery mass or chaotic mass, nothing distinguished from the other. It's before there were two things. And so for creation to happen, when you think about it, what one of the first things that's going to happen is you're going to have to create a space for creation. So you create a space for creation, and then you can organize that. I'm not a very good artist, and especially on my screen, that should be a circle. Looks like an earth, I hope. But you organize that in this spherical shape. Now it is different. Whatever has been created there, it's been organized in a way so that it's different than everything else. Now there are two things. All right? So when we think of it before the creation, think of it as being without form and void. We're going to come back to those phrases and really explore them in a minute, but think of that. Without form and void. There's nothing organized, nothing really there. It's just chaos, right? And then the way it's described in the creation account, and let me turn to this in Genesis chapter 1. So we turn to this in Genesis chapter 1, and we see in verse 2, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. That's water, right? It's on the face of the water, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. That's God working with this unorganized material and organizing it and creating a place whereon these may dwell, to use the language from Abraham chapter 3. Now think of this. Once he's created this organized space, there's still watery chaos all around it, but that space is organized. And that's part of what you're going to get when we jump down to verse 6 and say, God said, let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters, and let it divide the waters from the waters. Now, when we hear that, we usually think, oh, that's dry land, dividing the waters from the waters. But look as it keeps going. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from the waters which were above the firmament. And it was so, and God called the firmament heaven. And the evening and the morning were the second day. See, that's not what we were expecting when we thought that there was a firmament and then water on either side of it, because we're thinking of dry land. But think of this way that I've drawn here, this way of depicting creation, and you'll see that there are waters above and waters below this created space, this earth and its atmosphere and everything else. That's the firmament. That's the created space. Heaven, earth, everything, but there's no land yet, right? So it's just heaven with waters above and below. That's our created space that God has made for us there. So let's explore, again, this idea of organizing just a little bit. There are a couple of elements in the text that can help us understand the idea of organizing. Look at how it says, in the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The Hebrew word is bara. And the word bara means to form or to fashion. It means to take something that already exists and you form or fashion with it, like with clay or something like that, right? It's not to as I said, to take out of nothing and create something. It's to take something that exists and organize or form or fashion it. That's what creation means. And we can understand that even better as we go to the very next phrase. And we've already mentioned this a little bit. The was without form and void. That represents two Hebrew words, and it's actually a play on words. The writers of the Hebrew Bible were artists with their words, and they loved to have play on words in all sorts of ways. This is one of those. The phrase is tohu vabohu. All right, so it rhymed. It was without form and void, sounds nice, but not as cool as tohu vabohu. So let's explore what those words mean. Of course, Hebrew reads right to left, so tohu is the without form. That's there on the right there. That means uncultivated, or really not even, a better phrase would be unorganized or chaotic, all right? But I'm going to say uncultivated because I'm going to try and approximate the tohu vabohu and say that bohu means unpopulated, and that really is what it means. So we'll say uncultivated and unpopulated because that kind of rhymes like tohu vabohu, but let's say it's wild and wilderness and unorganized and unpopulated, right? That's what it means. So that's the two problems with creation. It's not organized and it's not populated. And so we're going to see that God fixes this in the creation account. Days 1 through 3 solve the uncultivated or unorganized part, and days 4 through 6 solve the unpopulated part. And we're going to say that day 1 corresponds in some ways with day 2, and day 3 with day 1 corresponds with day 4, day 2 with day 5, and day 3 with day 6. All right, so let's look at this as we give order to the chaos or the unorganized and unpopulated area. In day 1, we know that God divides light from dark. And in day 2, he'll divide water from water. This is when we get the firmament in between and the water above and the water below, and we have the firmament created, right? Day 3 divides water from land. And in day 3, we get a bonus creation. There are actually two things that are created in day 3. We get the bonus creation of plants, and he divides these into different kinds of plants, all sorts of different kinds of plants, and they will each create after their own kind, not something crazy going on, just this is this kind of plant, and it will always be this kind of plant, and it will get this kind of plant, and this is this kind of plant, and it will beget this kind of plant, right? You've got these plants organized in this way. Now we go to day 4, where he creates light and divides day from night. So it was a different kind of light. It's not the sun that's created in day 1. It's just light. In day 4, we get the sun and the moon and so on, and the earth going around, and that's going to create light and darkness. So we're going to divide light from darkness. In day 5, he's going to create fish and fowl and divide them up. This is this kind of fish, this is this kind of fish, and this is this kind of bird, this is this kind of bird, and they beget after their own kind, right? And in day 6, he's going to create beasts. Again, they'll beget after their own kind. And day 6, we also get a bonus creation, and a second thing being created in day 6, and that is man. And he divides mankind from everything else. All right, so that's fun stuff that is worth thinking about. Now, that's kind of the way we usually think of it. Now let's think of it in terms of dealing with tohu, or the wild place, the uncultivated place, the unorganized place, and bohu, the unpopulated place, right? It's the same place, but we're going to see him deal with tohu first, and then bohu. So what does he do on day 1 when he divides the light from the dark? Well, we find that God is present, and he starts to organize. That's the beginning of organization. He is going to take it from being a completely unorganized place and begin organization. On day 2, where he divides the water from the water, we're going to see he creates a space for organizing, and we get sky and sea. Not the way we think of it, that's going to happen on day 4, but in this way I drew earlier, right? But still you get sky and sea. On day 3, where he divides the water from land and creates plants and divides them, he's going to have this land that is used for organizing things, and he organizes plants. So that's a really helpful thing. You can see that on days 1 through 3, he organizes and gets rid of this problem that nothing is organized. Now let's look at how he populates things, starting on day 4, where he creates the light and divides the day from night. He does that by creating the sun and the stars and the moon, which we usually call, well, in the Bible, we usually call it the hosts of heaven. So what he actually does is he populates the heavens with all of these heavenly bodies. Then we get to day 5, where he's created and divided the fish and the fowl, and we're going to see that the sky and the sea were populated. Where on day 2, he had created the sky and sea, now he's going to populate the sky and sea. And on day 6, where he'd created beasts and then mankind, the land is populated, and of course, man is populated. He creates man, which starts to populate the earth. So land's populated with beasts, and man also starts to populate the land. And man is put in charge of the plants so that we have this corresponding thing, also put in charge of everything else. So I hope you can see the literary devices that help us see what God is doing as he organizes and creates. And that's the way that the ancient Israelites are going to conceive of this, is happening in this way out of watery chaos, organization, and population. I also want to thank my friend Josh Sears, who, while I've read this and thought of this a number of times, he helped me kind of really gel my thinking in being able to present it this way. So I'm grateful for him. There's another element that we should think of in terms of the literary account and stages of creation, and this is one that often has puzzled scholars, but I think as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we have a unique insight on this, because you get what seems like one creation account in Genesis chapter 1, and then another one in Genesis chapter 2, and it kind of goes in reverse order, covers some of the same ground, but with some different emphases and different order, and just one right after the other. This has been puzzling for a lot of people, and I can't tell you how much ink has been spilled on this, saying, well, one is creation from God's point of view and the other is creation from man's point of view. Or one is the creation account the way maybe some of the tribes of Israel had it and some is the way some other tribes of Israel had it. All sorts of ideas with this. Maybe there's some truth behind each of those things, but I think we have in the book of Moses some information that helps us make even more sense of this. So let's look at this as we go along, and this will help us find another way of looking at the stages of creation. So, as members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we believe that there was a spirit creation. That things were created spiritually before they were created physically. And we get this in Moses chapter 3, verse 5, which is a verse that doesn't have a corresponding verse in the Genesis account. That's the verse that's right between what people would call the two different creation accounts. And it has this explanation. So let's read what the Moses account has to say. We're going to start in verse 3 and get to verse 5. And I, God, blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it I had rested from all my work which I, God, had created and made. And now, behold, I say unto you that these are the generations of the heaven and of the earth when they were created, in the day that I, the Lord God, made the heaven and earth. And then we're going to have him start that second creation account in the Genesis account, but we have this additional verse in Moses chapter 3. And every plant of the field before it was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For I, the Lord God, created all things of which I have spoken spiritually before they were naturally upon the face of the earth. For I, the Lord God, had not caused it to rain upon the face of the earth, and I, the Lord God, had created all the children of men, and not yet a man to till the ground. For in heaven created I them, and there was not yet flesh upon the earth, neither in the water, neither in the air. So you get this important idea that there's a spiritual creation and then a physical creation, and that may account for at least some of, if not much of, the difference between these kind of two different ways of giving us the creation account, one right after the other that we have in Genesis, is this idea that we're reading about both a spiritual and a physical creation account. So let's go back to our stages of creation. We have this spirit creation that was spoken of in Moses chapter 3, verse 5, and then we have a physical creation. And this physical creation is in a different state than the state we're currently experiencing. It's a paradisaical physical creation. This is a creation where everything is in an Edenic state, or a perfect paradisaical state. And we can look at Moses chapter 3, verse 7 for that if we would like. Then finally, we get a physical creation that is a mortal or a fallen physical creation. So there are some differences between the paradisaical physical creation and the mortal or fallen physical creation. In the paradisaical physical creation, there is no blood, no death, no children, and no sin. Whereas in the mortal / physical or fallen physical creation, there is blood, there is death, there are children, thank goodness, and there is sin. So the difference between those two stages is the fall. And that's a great place then to launch from our discussion of creation into our discussion of the fall, because understanding the fall is part of understanding creation and part of understanding our mortal probation, and a correct understanding of it is incredibly important if we're really going to understand what we're doing here during our mortal probation. So we're going to start out by addressing two different questions. Was there a need for the fall, and did it have to happen that way? And by that way, I mean by transgression of the law. So let's start, first of all, with was there a need for the fall? And let me say this. First of all, if I typically in my classes, I have people by raise of hand. I say, was there a need for a fall? How many people say yes? And everyone raises their hand. And I say, how many people say no? And no one raises their hand. That's typical members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's not typical to our other Christian friends and to our Jewish friends. We have a unique standpoint on this, but we do have a doctrine on this. The fall was necessary. That we know and believe. But that leads us to a second question then. If it was necessary, then why didn't God create the world in an already fallen condition? Why not just start out fallen? And the answer is we don't know. I'll put forward some ideas for you to think about, but we don't have a doctrinal answer to this, or at least one that we can say, this is doctrine, this is why. We can only speculate. We can only think. And so I would encourage you to think it through. Why didn't God create the world in an already fallen state? I'm going to give you just 3 reasons that were put forth by Daniel H. Ludlow on why God didn't create a fallen world. The first of this is that it's contrary to the nature of God to create anything imperfect or unholy. God is perfect, and he only creates perfect things. If it's going to become imperfect, that will have to be because we made it imperfect. He creates perfect things or things that are good. All right, so that's one potential reason for you to think about. Second, it's contrary to the nature of God to entice men to violate law or to do evil. That's not what he does. He doesn't entice us in that way at all, but we need to have that enticement if we're going to have the kind of experience we need. So we'll have to live in a fallen world, but he won't create a world that has within it naturally enticement to violate law or to do evil. Now, let me just say here that this is, in my view, one of the reasons why that Satan played a role. Because Adam and Eve, before the fall, did not have a fallen nature to tempt them. See, I don't really need Satan to tempt me. I tempt myself just fine. I have a fallen nature that tempts me just fine. Satan also tempts us, but so we get a double whammy. But we have a fallen nature that will tempt us. Adam and Eve, before the fall, did not have a fallen nature. That had to be an outside force that would tempt them. All right, let's look at a third reason. If God created a world in which there was opposition, sin, and evil, then we could hold him responsible for such conditions. But instead, these conditions are the result of our choice. The way Boyd K. Packer put it is, there was too much at issue to introduce man into mortality by force. That would contravene the very law essential to the plan. In other words, agency is a key element here. If we were going to live in a fallen world, Adam and Eve had to choose to be in a fallen world, and then we chose to follow them. All right. Those are some ideas as to why God didn't create it in a fallen state. In the end, I'll emphasize we don't know. I'm trying to be very careful about what we actually know and what we don't know. We know the fall is necessary. We can try and think about and reason through why it's not created in an already fallen state. So let's come to that second question. Did it have to happen that way, or did it have to happen through transgression? Now, in my classes, when I do this and I say, raise your hand if you think it had to happen by transgression, I'd say I'll get a majority of people raising their hands, but not everyone. And then I'll say, how many people think it didn't have to happen that way? And I get a few people raising their hands. And then I ask, how many people don't know? And I get quite a few raising their hands that way. That's also typical. Almost anywhere I go, that's the response I'll get from members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I will tell you that we do not have a doctrinal answer to this. I do not know if it had to happen through transgression. I'll tell you, I think it's quite likely it did, and I'll talk about that as I go along, but there are a number of other people who are smarter than I am who think that, no, it didn't have to happen that way. I can't quite figure out another way that it could happen, but there are a number of people who are very faithful, very intelligent members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints who think it didn't have to happen through transgression. Let's go to 2 Nephi chapter 2, verse 22 to try and understand this a little bit. There it reads, and now behold, if Adam had not transgressed, he would not have fallen. Now, that can be read a couple of different ways. This can be read to say, well, this is how it happened. It happened that he did transgress and he fell, so we're talking about how it happened. That's one way of reading this. Another is to just read it the way it reads on the face of it, which is to say, if he doesn't transgress, he doesn't fall. That suggests that it's necessary, transgression was necessary for the fall. Let's continue on. But he would have remained in the Garden of Eden, and all things which were created must have remained in the same state in which they were after they were created, and they must have remained forever and had no end. And then the purpose of the creation would have been thwarted. We would have never had our opportunity for immortal probation if everything stayed in that Edenic state. We needed to be fallen beings in a fallen world to have the kind of mortal probation, the testing, trying, and opportunity for growth that was necessary for us to be successful and return to God in a higher and holier state. And so whether it had to happen through the fall or not, and we'll continue to explore that as we go along, the fall was necessary. But that leads us to another question. People often ask, what about two contradicting commandments? We get the first commandment, which is to multiply and replenish the earth, and they can't fulfill that before the fall. We don't know why. We don't understand why Adam and Eve could not have children before the fall, but for some reason, they could not have children before the fall. And so these seem like they're two contradictory commandments, that Adam and Eve were unable to keep the first commandment, to multiply and replenish the earth, without breaking the second commandment, which is to partake of the fruit. And it's only by transgressing that, it would seem, that they are then able to have children. Let's explore what some great Latter-day Saint leaders and thinkers have had to say about this. We'll end up often going to Joseph Fielding Smith and John A. Widtsoe, and there's a reason for this. In the earlier days of the church, in very early days, when members of the church had questions, they would actually write into the first presidency, and the first presidency would answer those questions. But as the church got larger, that became impractical. And so Heber J. Grant asked John A. Widtsoe to start fielding the questions for them. Elder Widtsoe was an apostle and a very intelligent man and a great and prolific writer. And so he asked him if he would field those questions. And he started writing them in what was known as the Improvement Era, the church's magazine at the time. And so he answered questions for a long time in a column that he called Evidences and Reconciliations. Later, many of those columns were put into a series of books called Evidences and Reconciliations. When Elder Widtsoe died, they asked Joseph Fielding Smith to take up that column in his place. He changed the name of the column to Answers to Gospel Questions. And of course, later, many of those columns, those little things he wrote, were put into a few books. As a result, because people had a lot of questions about this issue, Elder Widtsoe and Elder Smith wrote more answers to it than just about anyone else. And so we'll turn to them a few times, including as we begin, and we read this from Joseph Fielding Smith. He said, Adam and Eve were chosen to come here as the primal parents of humanity, and they were placed in the Garden of Eden where there was no death, and we read in the Scriptures that they could have lived in that garden forever, but not under the most favorable circumstances. For there, although they were in the presence of God, they were deprived of certain knowledge and understanding in a condition where they could not understand clearly things that were necessary for them to know. Therefore, it became essential to their salvation and to ours that their nature should be changed. The only way it could be changed was by the violation of the law under which they were at that time. So according to Elder Smith, as he writes this, transgression was necessary. That's his idea in this writing. Mortality could not come without violation of that law, and mortality was essential, a step towards our exaltation. Therefore, Adam partook of the forbidden fruit, forbidden in a rather peculiar manner, for it is the only place in all the history where we read that the Lord forbade something and yet said, Nevertheless, thou mayest choose for thyself. He never said that of any sin. I do not look upon Adam's fall as a sin, although it was a transgression of the law, the temporal law, and he became subject to death. The partaking of that fruit created blood in his body, and that blood became the life-giving influence of mortality. So you can see what Elder Smith is trying to say here, that the way that the commandment is given is a clue that there's something a little bit different going on here. So to highlight that point, I'm going to put this up in a way that my friend Terry Zink has shown this to his students. Have you ever seen a commandment that went like this? Thou shalt not murder, nevertheless thou mayest choose for thyself, for it is given unto thee. And of course, obviously, no. You've never seen that commandment or other commandments given that way. There's something different going on here, is what Elder Smith is arguing, that the addition of that phrase makes it clear that God is doing something else. So elsewhere, Elder Smith explains it this way in Answers to Gospel Questions. Just why the Lord would say to Adam that he forbade him to partake of the tree is not made clear in the Bible account, but in the original, as it comes to us in the book of Moses, it is made definitely clear. It is that the Lord said to Adam that if he wished to remain as he was in the garden, then he was not to eat the fruit. But if he desired to eat it and partake of death, he was at liberty to do so. So really, it was not in the true sense a transgression of a divine commandment. Adam made the wise decision, in fact, the only decision that he could make. So you see what Elder Smith is arguing here, that God is explaining to Adam, if you want to remain here, you cannot partake of this fruit. If you don't want to remain here, then you'll have to transgress my commandment that says to not partake of the fruit and deal with the consequences of that. Now it's up to you to choose which consequences you want. All right? John A. Widtsoe in Evidences and Reconciliations put it this way: the eternal power of choice was respected by the Lord himself. It really converts the command into a warning, as much as if to say, if you do this thing, you will bring upon yourself a certain punishment, but do it if you choose. The Lord had warned Adam and Eve of the hard battle with earth conditions if they chose to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. He would not subject his son and daughter to hardship and the death of their bodies unless it be of their own choice. They must choose for themselves. They chose wisely in accord with the heavenly law of love for others. Let's read one more thing from Joseph Fielding Smith. He said, mortality was created through the eating of the forbidden fruit, if you want to call it forbidden. But I think the Lord has made it clear that it was not forbidden. He merely said to Adam, if you want to stay here in the garden, this is the situation. If so, don't eat it. So Elder Smith and Elder Widtsoe and lots of other great leaders and thinkers in the church have argued that this was a choice that God gave to Adam and Eve. He explained to them the consequences. He forbade them from eating the fruit, and let's explore that for just a minute, and then we'll come back to this. Why would he forbid them from eating it if they had to partake of it? In the end, we don't know. This is my best guess, my best understanding. I think that we could not be forced out of God's presence for no reason at all. We had the right to be in God's presence if we were holy beings. We had that right, and yet mortality required that we be away from God's presence. Just like when I sent my kids to kindergarten, there was a part of me that wanted to go in with them and make sure that everything would be okay, but it turns out they wouldn't really grow if their dad was with them all the time. So they had to go out on their own, and that creates the kind of growth they needed. We needed to leave God's presence, to be forced away from God's presence, to have no option to have his presence if we were going to grow the way that we need to grow. And so that couldn't happen if we were worthy of his presence, and so only something that made us unholy or unworthy of his presence could make it so that we could not be with him and have the conditions necessary for a fallen world. I don't know if that's really the reason why or not, but it makes some sense to me. So to go back to this argument that so many Latter-day Saint thinkers have made, God has explained to Adam and Eve, this is something that you can choose to do. And then eventually Adam and Eve figure out that it's what was necessary. And they made that difficult choice. Eve, thank goodness, led the way, and we're so grateful that Adam was wise enough to follow Eve. And so leading the way, Eve makes the difficult choice to separate herself from God and to go into a fallen world so that the plan can be furthered, so that mankind can come into the world, and so that we can have the kind of mortal probation that we need. And Adam followed her, and we should be grateful to Adam and Eve for making that choice. But as we explore this, it becomes important to explore the difference between sin and transgression, all right? Now, let me be clear about this, and President Oaks, when he was Elder Oaks, made this distinction as well. Most scriptural writers, when they are talking about sin or transgression, they use the words to mean exactly the same thing. They use transgression most of the time to mean sin. It's only a few times when we really want to make a distinction between two different things that transgression is used to mean something different than sin. And it's important that we realize that, because as you're reading the scriptures, if you think every time transgression is used it means something different than sin, then we're going to struggle, because it's not used that way most of the time. But when we want to make a distinction, then we use them in two different ways. And when we do that, it means sin is when you know the law and you willfully choose to go against it. And transgression is when you break a law. There are two different ways that when we want to make a distinction between two different things, sin or transgression, there are two different kinds of distinctions made. One of those has to do with our state of knowledge or understanding. When we want to say that sin is a willful, knowing rebellion against God, you know something is wrong and you choose to do it anyway, as opposed to transgression when you don't know, but you've done it anyway. So let me give you an example. There was a time when I took two of my children to the store. One was 10, one was 2. And the people at the store are very clever. As you wait in line, they have lots of candy right at the eye height of children. And they both wanted some candy. And being a good father, I told them no, they couldn't have any candy. And they weren't happy with that, but that's how it was. So we get out to the car, and I strap my 2-year-old in the seat, and we're driving home. And as I look in the mirror while she's in the car, she's sucking on a ring pop. She's happy as can be, just sucking on this thing. And it turns out she had grabbed it as we were leaving, and she'd taken it with her. Now, I have to say that according to the state of understanding, and the Book of Mormon makes this more clear than anywhere else, that if you don't know or understand the law, it's a transgression as opposed to a sin. According to her state of understanding, I would have to say this is a transgression. 2-year-olds pretty much think if they can hold something, it's theirs. That's the state of their understanding. But my 10-year-old, if he had taken it, glad to say he didn't, but if he had taken it, he understood very well that that would have been stealing. So if they'd both engaged in the same act, for one it would have been a sin, and for the other a transgression. That has to do with their state of understanding or their knowledge about the law. Now, we've just been saying that Adam and Eve had a fairly decent understanding of what would happen when they partook of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. I would still argue that this was a transgression rather than a sin based on their state of knowledge or understanding. And it's because they were missing or absent of a particular kind of knowledge, and that is experiential knowledge. It may have been explained to them that if they partook of this fruit, that they would have pain and they would have suffering. But if you have never experienced pain or suffering, those words do not mean very much. And they don't really understand what they're getting themselves into. So in some ways they do, and in some ways it's impossible. I would imagine the first time they had pain, it was a shock. That when they had suffering, it was a shock what that was because they had no experience with it. And so they couldn't fully understand it. So I would argue that under that distinction, they still didn't fully understand, and they made a wise choice, and yet still I would argue it's a transgression as opposed to a sin. There's another way that Elder Oaks, then Elder Dallin H. Oaks, explained a difference between the law, or sin versus transgression. He says, some acts, like murder, are crimes because they are inherently wrong. Other acts, like operating without a license, are crimes only because they are legally prohibited. Under these distinctions, the act that produced the fall was not a sin, inherently wrong, but a transgression, wrong because it was formally prohibited. These words are not always used to denote something different, but this distinction seems meaningful in the circumstances of the fall. So let's just say we should be careful of this. I agree 100%, and it's nice of me to agree with Elder Oaks, who certainly understands this better than I do. But I would agree 100%, but we have to be careful with this. So let's say we know under the law of Moses you could drink wine, but under the word of wisdom, the way we have it today, you can't drink wine. So there must not be something inherently wrong with drinking wine. But I would not say that gives you license to go out and drink a lot of wine because it's only a transgression, it's not a sin, because this brings us to knowing that God has prohibited it, and you are fully and willfully rebelling against God, then it becomes a sin. But for Adam and Eve, I would argue that this is still a transgression if it has been explained to them the way that Elder Smith and Elder Widsoe and others have said it has. That God explained it to them and said, nevertheless, thou mayest choose for thyself, for it is given unto thee. In this case, then, it's both not inherently wrong, and they are not rebelling against God because he has given them that option. So I would argue that this is a transgression as opposed to a sin. Let's look at one more element of this question, could it happen without transgression? And we're going to read from Elder Widsoe, who says this. It is a thrilling thought that Adam and Eve were not coerced to begin God's work on earth. They chose to do so by the exercise of their free agency. It is the lesson for all their children: seek truth, choose wisely, and carry the responsibility for acts. That, I think, is worth thinking through again. They used their agency and did so to further mortality for all of us and the opportunity to progress and be with God. But that leads us to the question, were they deceived? And that's a tough question. Were they deceived? Most of the time, the scriptures use the word beguiled, and beguiled doesn't necessarily mean deceived. In fact, we learned that in the Book of Mormon that you can catch people with guile even if you're an honest man and leading them to an honest thing. You've beguiled them into doing a good thing. right? So beguile doesn't necessarily mean deceit. Paul does say that Eve was deceived. So the question is, on what level was she deceived? And the answer is we don't know. Was she deceived in the way that this decision should have been made? Meaning that she should have talked to Adam before she acted? Perhaps. Was she deceived when Satan said, "You shall not surely die," and perhaps she believed him? Perhaps. In the end, I don't know exactly how she was deceived and in what manner, but I think it's worth reading this. Let's go to Moses chapter 4, verse 6. This is, again, the book of Moses is the Joseph Smith translation of the first part of the Bible, and it has some fantastic insights into what we would normally be reading in Genesis. So in Moses chapter 4, verse 6, it says this, "And Satan put it into the heart of the serpent, for he had drawn away many after him, and he sought also to beguile Eve, for he knew not the mind of God, wherefore he sought to destroy the world." Now that's interesting because what it tells us is that Satan thought that getting Eve to partake of the fruit would destroy the world and thwart God's plan, whereas in reality, it really furthered God's plan. And so my question is, really, who got the better of whom in this situation? And I would say that Eve is the one who really comes out in the better position. She may have been deceived, but she also, in my opinion, was wise enough to make the choice that needed to be made and do what was right and what was necessary and what God wanted to have happen. And this then is going to be a frustration for Satan, and I would guess that he's had it out for Eve and her descendants ever since. Let's read this then from Elder Dallin H. Oakes. He says, "It was Eve who first transgressed the limits of Eden in order to initiate the conditions of mortality. Her act, whatever its nature, was formally a transgression, but eternally a glorious necessity to open the doorway toward eternal life. Adam showed his wisdom by doing the same, and thus Eve and Adam fell that men might be." So you see what he's saying, and these are the two synonyms, these are the two adjectives that are used most often to describe Eve when you're looking at how Latter-day Saints talk about her: courage and wisdom. Let's read this also from Elder Russell M. Nelson. He says, "If that state had persisted," that's the Garden of Eden state, "you and I would still be stranded among the heavenly host as unborn sons and daughters of God. The great plan of happiness would have been frustrated. That leads us to the fall of Adam. To bring the plan of happiness to fruition, God issued to Adam and Eve the first commandment ever given to mankind. It was explained to them, should they eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, their bodies would change, mortality and eventual death would come upon them. But partaking of the fruit was prerequisite to their parenthood. While I do not fully understand all the biochemistry," that's where you can tell it's President Nelson, right? "While I do not fully understand all the biochemistry involved, I do know that their physical bodies did change. Blood began to circulate in their bodies. Adam and Eve thereby became mortal. Happily for us, they could also beget children and fulfill the purposes for which the world was created. Happily for them, the Lord said to Adam and Eve, 'Behold, I have forgiven thee thy transgression in the Garden of Eden.' We and all mankind are forever blessed because of Eve's great courage and wisdom. By partaking of the fruit first, she did what needed to be done. Adam was wise enough to do likewise. Accordingly, we could speak of the fall of Adam in terms of a mortal creation because Adam fell that men might be." Now, in order to highlight this, let's read from a scriptural account from Moses chapter 5, verses 10 through 11. "And in that day Adam blessed God and was filled and began to prophesy concerning all the families of the earth, saying, 'Blessed be the name of God, for because of my transgression my eyes are opened, and in this life I shall have joy, and again in the flesh I shall see God.' And Eve his wife heard all these things and was glad, saying, 'Were it not for our transgression, we never should have had seed, and never should have known good and evil, and the joy of our redemption, and the eternal life which God giveth unto all the obedient.'" Thank goodness for these righteous parents who made it possible for mortal probation to move forward. Let's end with this question. Are there consequences for an incorrect view of the fall? I want you to think about that for a second. Are there consequences for not understanding the fall correctly? I would argue that there are. I would argue that there are a few different consequences that come from misunderstanding the fall, and one of them has happened for a very long time, and that's a misunderstanding of the nature of women, and sometimes thinking of women as being lesser than men because Eve partook of the fruit first. Elder Oakes has answered that resoundingly. He says, some Christians condemn Eve for her act, concluding that she and her daughters are somehow flawed by it. Not the Latter-day Saints. Informed by revelation, we celebrate Eve's act and honor her wisdom and courage in the great episode called the fall. So, thank goodness that we understand it correctly. Let me mention at least one other thing, although I'm sure there are other consequences of understanding the fall incorrectly, but let me think of this. Let's say that the Lord forbid, but let's say that something terrible happens to you. You're struck by cancer, Parkinson's, MS, something terrible like this. And you can approach this challenge in a few ways. You could approach this saying, this is because Adam and Eve made that stupid mistake and partook of the fruit and thrust us into a fallen world, and now we have to deal with these terrible consequences when we shouldn't have to. How am I going to get through this? Right? That's one way of approaching it, but contrast that with a way we can approach this informed by this latter-day understanding, this restoration understanding of the fall, when we say, this is a consequence of having a fallen body in a fallen world, but I wanted to be in a fallen body in a fallen world because I knew that would create the conditions that allow me to grow and become more godlike and Christ-like with Christ's help. Therefore, the question is, how do I take this trial and allow it to help me to become more Christ-like? That's a radically different way of understanding the things that happen to us because we understand the fall correctly. Thank goodness we have been taught so much about the creation and the fall and the role of our Father in it, our role in it, and the role of our Father's Son, Jesus Christ, and His atoning sacrifice throughout all of it. I am so grateful for that, and I thank the Lord for it in the name of His Son, even Jesus Christ. Amen.